Logical Fallacies. What are logical fallacies, and why is it important that critical thinkers should know about them? A logical fallacy is an error we can make in reasoning, but it usually crops up when we are discussing or arguing our point of view. Some people might even knowingly use them to try and score cheap points in an argument due to intellectual laziness. They are traps we can fall into, but if we know what to look out for, we can spot them when they occur and stop ourselves from using them. This week we'll look at ad hominem.
The ad hominem fallacy, also known as an ad hominem attack, is when you make negative points or comments about aspects of your opponent, sometimes personal, instead of attacking their point of view or their argument.
The term ad hominem comes from Latin and translates as against the man. You may also have heard the expression to play the man and not the ball. So instead of making our argument by looking at and tackling the points made by our opponent, we might attack something about them that we, and maybe others, don't like, or try to paint them in a bad light in the hope of scoring points.
You didn't even attend a university or have any degrees at all. You are in no position to lecture me on this topic.
If your opponent's argument is based on good grounds, it really doesn't matter if they went to a university or not. If a person with only a rudimentary education says the world is round and the sky is blue, they are still right. But be careful. A lack of education in a particular topic can weaken your opponent's argument, and your argument too if you don't have expertise.
I don't think a person from your background can really comment on these matters. What would you know? You weren't even born here.
Where someone comes from or other aspects of their life and upbringing does not mean their point of view is therefore automatically wrong. Listen to the argument itself and don't let other aspects of the person making that argument sway you one way or another.
You also support the government, or the president, or the prime minister, so of course you would say that.
Someone's point of view may well be coloured by what political party they support, but again, that does not mean their arguments are automatically wrong or automatically right. Watch out for the ad hominem attack. If somebody attacks aspects of you and not your arguments, tell them to stick to the question at hand. If you find yourself attacking something about your opponent you don't like, it might be time to stop and wonder if your own arguments are on shaky ground. This week we'll look at the appeal to authority.
The use of the perceived knowledge or expertise or even celebrity of someone or an institution to add weight to your argument or to justify your decisions.
In science, there are no ultimate authorities. Now, what do I mean by this? No one, no matter how qualified they are in their special field of knowledge, is regarded as having all the answers and always being right. There may well be other experts in the same area of knowledge who disagree. Like the rest of us, even experts can make mistakes. As science is an ongoing process, no one could ever have the final answers in a field of knowledge or study. Also, someone who is regarded as an authority or expert in one area of knowledge, astronomy for example, may not be qualified to comment on climate science or geology, and so on.
I know homeopathy works. It's based on energy frequencies. Even Albert Einstein knew this when he said, "Everything is energy, and that's all there is to it. Match the frequency of the reality you want, and you cannot help but get that reality. It can be no other way. This is not philosophy. This is physics.
Poor old Einstein. His name has been used so many times over the decades to justify all sorts of claims. Not only did Einstein never say this classic fake quote, the quote itself makes no sense at all. It is just a bunch of science-sounding words mashed together in something we call a word salad. The important thing to remember is that invoking the name of Einstein or anyone else does not therefore mean your point is correct.
I always eat mint ice biscuits in the evening. I know they're good, as world uphill skiing champion Mary Boyd endorses them. Or, I believe in the new age healing power of reconnected energy spirits. I mean, if it's good enough for movie star Elfrida Parks, it's good enough for me.
Just because someone famous or someone you admire advertises or endorses a product or even an idea or philosophy, it doesn't mean that the product or idea is the right one for you or anyone else. Many people can be convinced of the amazing health benefits of something, only to find out later it was just a placebo. Of course it might be a fine product after all and really work, but try to judge it on its own merits. Mint ice biscuits aren't any better or worse just because someone you like promotes them. It's important to keep in mind that many times experts in their field are called experts because they have studied a subject over many years and often do indeed know what they are talking about. They have earned the right to be listened to, but in the end, even they can be wrong. This week we'll look at the appeal to antiquity.
Also known as the appeal to tradition, this is when you argue an idea or practice is valid because it has been in use, or even thought to have been in use, for tens, hundreds, or thousands of years.
Many ideas have withstood the test of time. Our ancient ancestors discovered amazing things that still hold true today. If you eat certain plants, they will make you sick, whereas if you eat other plants, they can help make you feel better, and so on. But that doesn't mean that every idea or practice used for many years is therefore right or even real.
People have been doing it this way for generations. If it worked for them, it must be right.
Maybe or maybe not. For many years it was thought that bloodletting or bleeding sick people would help cure them. This was done for generation after generation. However, we now know that this was far more harmful than helpful.
Raw milk is safe to drink, as our ancestors did so for thousands of years, and they were fine.
Firstly, our ancestors did in fact sometimes become sick from drinking raw milk. Furthermore, the Industrial Revolution resulted in increased transportation and storage times of milk, rendering it less safe than when it was drunk at the farm of origin. This led to the development of pasteurisation, which helped provide safe milk without any reduction in nutrition. It has saved countless lives as it kills harmful organisms responsible for such diseases as listeriosis, typhoid fever, tuberculosis and diphtheria. Foodborne illnesses are particularly dangerous for anyone with weakened immunity, such as the elderly, young children and pregnant women. Others with more robust immunity will probably survive food poisoning, but it's an unnecessarily unpleasant experience that can be avoided by drinking pasteurised milk rather than raw milk. Just because a practice has existed for many generations, that doesn't make the belief in the practice true.
Homeopathy is hundreds of years old. If it didn't work, no one would use it. Yet, millions of people rely on it and use it every day.
There is no doubt in the scientific community that homeopathy does not work and cannot work. The principles on which it is based have been shown over the years to be false. To be fair, it was invented at a time when our knowledge of medicine and biology was far less sophisticated than it is today. And by the way, it does not matter how many people think something works or something is right. That is known as the appeal to popularity and will be the subject of next week's segment. This week, we'll look at the appeal to popularity.
Also known as being on the bandwagon, this is when you try to add weight to your point of view by pointing out that many people also agree with you.
We've all seen this sort of thing, especially from advertisers who claim thousands of people use our product every day and they all can't be wrong. Well, yes, the product might work and be wonderful, but at other times, thousands of people can indeed be wrong.
Everyone at school has one. Come on, I really need this.
Maybe you remember making this argument to your parents when you were at school. Something would come along, a new toy or device maybe, and it becomes very popular. Suddenly, you having one as well is very important. Whatever it is might not really be that good, but its popularity makes it desirable.
All my friends use homeopathy to treat everything from rash to insomnia.
This discredited medical quackery simply does not and cannot work as claimed. Yet thousands and thousands of people all over the world swear by it. Just because some or many people use a product or believe in something, it doesn't mean it works or it's real. If one person can be wrong about something, then hundreds or thousands or millions can be as well.
By far, the majority of climate scientists agree that climate change is real and humans are a major contributing factor.
Now here's the flip side of this logical fallacy. Sometimes the weight of opinion is right. Science can and does change its mind, but it relies largely on consensus. In other words, on the conclusion of most scientists in that area of study. In the end, the popularity of an idea should not determine the validity of that idea. It must stand or fall on its own merits, but it is appealing to think that if many people agree with you, then you must be right. This week we'll look at straw man.
This is when we substitute a person's actual position or argument with a distorted, exaggerated or misrepresented version of their position or point of view.
A straw man, or a figure made out of straw, is easy to burn down. It is far easier to attack something weak, even if it has nothing to do with what your opponent is trying to say, than to attack a strong argument.
She said she briefly saw something that appeared light and creepy, and she couldn't figure out what it was. Why would she resort to ghosts as an explanation?
The original person did not actually state that she thought she saw a ghost. Her point has been taken further and built up into something more extreme that is considered nonsense. It's much easier to just knock down a suggestion that a ghost appeared than to delve into the possible causes of what was experienced, especially if no explanations can be provided. By misrepresenting the original claim, it can then be dismissed outright rather than addressed.
The government is hiding the fact that aliens are living on Earth. That Air Force testing ranges are off limits and highly guarded is evidence that aliens are being held there.
Of course, the Air Force range is off limits and highly guarded. This is true no matter what country you're in. But this fact has nothing to do with whether or not aliens or anything else are being kept a secret.
You skeptics say you can test my psychic abilities, but your tests are impossible to pass. I never said I was 100% accurate.
This excuse from people claiming psychic powers in order to not be tested is one we've heard again and again over the decades. Skeptics never impose a condition of being 100% accurate in a test of paranormal powers. Our real position is that we will test someone based on what they say their success rate is. Maybe they only claim 75% accuracy. That's fine. We can test for that. By saying we insist on 100%, they are using a totally exaggerated and false condition of a test to make it appear that skeptics are unreasonable. Many so-called psychics will look for any excuse not to take the skeptic's challenge. But you might be interested to know that many people claiming to be water diviners, that is, to have the power to find underground water or metals using divining rods or pendulums, often claim to be 100% accurate. It can be tricky to tell when your opponent sets up a straw man to burn down. If you spot it, point out that what they are saying is not really representative of your point of view. As always, don't get too upset if you miss it. Logical fallacies can slip by anyone. This week we'll look at post hoc ergo propter hoc.
Also known as assuming the cause, the faulty causal assumption, or just post hoc. This is when two events occur in succession, and it is believed that the first event must have caused the second event. Or to put it another way, the second event is a result of the first event.
It's the fallacy that applies when believing in superstition like positive outcomes due to lucky charms, etc. It also commonly occurs when alternative medicine is credited as providing a cure or science-based medicine is blamed for an unrelated condition. We all know mother's chicken soup will cure the common cold, right? I mean, only a few days after you eat some, the cold will get better.
I put up an umbrella in the house today, and you know what? Shortly after, I lost my wallet.
Good things and bad things happen to us all. Normally, that's just part of everyday life and we don't think much about it. Once in a while, however, something very bad happens to us and we are left looking for a reason. Putting up an umbrella inside, walking under a ladder, or a black cat crossing your path are all classic superstitions, and it's easy to see why some people might latch onto these when looking for a reason as to why they had bad luck later on. Oh, and don't forget, superstitions are, as Webster's dictionary has it, a belief or practice resulting from ignorance, fear of the unknown, trust in magic or chance, or a false conception of causation.
I was perfectly healthy until I started using a 5G cell phone. Now I have cancer.
It could be insensitive to start schooling a person battling cancer on its possible causes. But I think we can understand how people need to find a reason for things, especially things they are trying to come to terms with, even if they come to the wrong conclusion. Sometimes any conclusion is better than none at all. Why did this happen to me? Is a question as old as our species. In this case, the reality is that while ionising radiation is indeed dangerous, the non-ionising level of radiation we are exposed to via 5G does not present any known risks to us. The worst we are likely to experience is warming on the skin that is so slight that we won't even notice it. But this fact doesn't stop people from blaming it for health problems, real or imagined.
I was suffering from too many negative emotions until I tried smudging. Since then, my mind is clear and I feel positive.
Smudging is a practice trending in the wellness industry that has been popularised by social media. In Western culture, it involves burning small bundles of foliage containing white sage that are commercially available in kits. It is based on the ancient ceremonial practice of sage burning by First Nations people in the Americas. Maybe in some ways, smudging does offer some help. Perhaps the act of waving the smoking sticks around is enjoyable, and negative emotions are replaced with positive ones. And let's not forget how powerful rituals are in human societies. However, there are no chemical properties of smoke that promote emotional and physical health. In fact, inhaling smoke is more likely to cause harm. Therefore, it is a fallacy to think the improvement is caused by the smoky air per se. It could also be a placebo effect, or a mood that eventually improves on its own anyway.
My child was perfectly fine until they had the MMR vaccine. Then, only months later, they were diagnosed with autism.
Here we see causality assigned incorrectly, and the vaccines blamed as a cause for what is probably a genetic condition. From systematic reviews of studies based on millions of children around the world, we know that vaccines do not result in children developing autism. The love and the need you have to protect your children can very easily colour your thinking. How satisfying it is when we think we have found the reason why something is happening. It's a very deep need within us all to find out the answer to the age-old question, why? Jumping to a false conclusion can be more satisfying than having no conclusion at all. In the end, when assigning credit or blame to one occurrence that preceded another, be sure that you have credible evidence that there really is a true cause and effect relationship. This week, we'll look at begging the question.
Also known as circular reasoning, this is when the answer to the question is implied in the wording of the question itself. The premise of the question and the foregone conclusion support each other in a circular way without referring to any external, actual evidence.
We often hear the term, "that begs the question," in TV and radio interviews with politicians, for example. What the interviewer really should say is, "that prompts the question," or "that raises the question," as that is what they really mean. When using the term to refer to a logical fallacy, begging the question is not really asking a valid question at all, but it does imply that the premise of the statement needs challenging before a conclusion can be drawn.
Hey, skeptic, how do you explain that my auntie saw a UFO when she was a girl in the 1970s? It was as plain as day.
This example is based on a real question put to a skeptical investigator during an interview. Within the question itself is the answer that the auntie did indeed see a real UFO. Not that the auntie said she thought she saw a UFO, or imagined she saw a UFO, or said she saw something strange in the sky, but did in fact see a real UFO. And remember that in common usage, UFO does not mean unidentified flying object, it means alien spaceship. It can be hard to try and answer this question without pointing out the logical fallacy.
A paranormal investigator was sent to investigate strange noises in an old house. She looked at the owner and said, "Ghosts have been known to make these noises. How long has this house been haunted?"
Here the investigator seems to have made up her mind that whatever the strange noises were, they were the result of ghosts. The question she put to the owner assumes not only that ghosts are real and the house is haunted, but this is the cause of the noises.
I know my favourite alternative medicine works because it comes from nature, and natural is best.
There is no reason to think that just because something comes from nature, that it therefore works and is good for you. There are many deadly poisons to be found in nature. Furthermore, there is nothing to say that natural is better than artificial. It's the dose that determines whether or not something is harmful, helpful, or just inapplicable. Declaring that something works or is good just because it comes from nature is indeed begging the question, and is also an appeal to nature logical fallacy. As we've said, you'll often hear the phrase, "that begs the question," when people really mean "that prompts the question." So just remember that language is evolving all the time. But if you hear someone really begging the question in an argument, you might ask them to rephrase the question. And try not to beg the question yourself, which is all too easy to do when you are sure of your point of view. This week we'll look at the argument from ignorance.
Also known as the appeal to ignorance, this is when you assert something is true or could be true because no one has proved it to be false. This fallacy wrongly shifts the burden of proof away from the person making the claim.
We all know what a UFO is, don't we? What do you think it is? I'll give you a second. Now, if you are thinking something like an alien spaceship that is visiting Earth, then it could be said you are making an argument from ignorance. Remember that the U in UFO stands for unidentified. It could be any number of things, from a bird to a plane to, well, you get the idea. The fact that no one has proved something unidentified in the sky is not an alien spaceship does not therefore mean it is one.
The ancient Egyptians had access to advanced technology and knowledge that has been lost for millennia. How else could they have built the pyramids? Even today, scientists are baffled by how it could be done. Were they helped by advanced aliens? This surely is proof that the Earth has been visited by extraterrestrials.
While it's certainly true that there are many aspects of the construction of the pyramids we don't yet understand, it does not therefore mean the ancient Egyptians had access to technology or science far more advanced than our own. In fact, with every passing year, we understand more and more about how the pyramids were constructed, and never, not once, have we discovered evidence of some amazing alien technology. What we do find is how resourceful and inventive the ancient Egyptians were. Remember, they were humans, just like you and me.
Science does not know the limits of the human brain, so it could be that there is a part of the brain that is able to send and receive psychic messages.
The first part of this statement is true enough, as science is still learning about the human brain. But that does not therefore mean psychic powers must or even might exist. No one has proven that invisible unicorns from another dimension aren't running around the streets, but that is no reason to think that they are.
I went to a Reiki practitioner who cleansed and balanced my energies, which cured my insomnia. Just because science hasn't detected healing energies yet, it doesn't mean they don't exist. Science doesn't know everything. There are other ways of knowing.
It's just so easy to accept something like Reiki, needless to say an unproven modality, seems to work when you think it has worked for you. It also makes sense to look for a reason as to why it seems to work. That the reason given makes no real sense scientifically really doesn't matter when someone is convinced by perceived outcomes of the modality. You'll often find that people think that just because something has not been shown to be false or not the case, the opposite must be true, or at least could be true. As unsatisfying as it can be, sometimes the best answer a skeptic can give is, I don't know. This week we'll look at special pleading.
This is when, instead of admitting your point of view or argument is wrong, you try to find a loophole that gives you an out and saves you from defeat. It is also when a person makes an exception to a universal principle because they are holding on tight to a belief that doesn't align with that principle.
We see this situation so often in skeptical investigations, from so-called psychics to water diviners to people who claim they have invented a perpetual motion machine. When it comes to the crunch and they fail to demonstrate their claim, they will always find a way to excuse the failure and preserve their worldview.
Normally, I'm 100% successful when I'm water divining. I never miss. But when I was tested by the skeptics, my divining power didn't work. However, I know why. Those skeptics had me tested on the wrong type of water, and that threw me off.
Believe it or not, this was the actual argument made by a water diviner after failing a test of his claimed ability. Of all the people tested by Australian skeptics over the decades, it's the water diviners who come up with the most creative examples of special pleading. None of them, not one, of the hundreds who have tried, have passed the agreed-to tests.
I know I failed to find the treasure using my psychic powers, but it wasn't my fault. My spirit guide led me to the wrong place to teach me a lesson in humility.
Once again, we have an example based on a real excuse given by someone claiming to be a psychic. Not only did the so-called psychic find a way to justify their failure, they also found a way to reinforce their belief in the paranormal at the same time. A for effort.
It's simply amazing how well acupuncture works. It doesn't matter that science cannot identify the mechanism by which it works. We don't need to wait for science to catch up to what we already know. Anyway, science clearly isn't able to discover how acupuncture works.
This example of special pleading has been used for many years by those promoting acupuncture, so-called energy healing, homeopathy, and many other forms of alternative medicine. When the scientific evidence is lacking, they will blame science for not understanding or even for not being able to understand. We humans are very good at doing everything we can to preserve our beliefs and our worldview. It could be said to be a form of natural defence as the mind looks for ways to protect itself. It is something you should take into consideration when arguing with someone who is truly convinced of their own point of view. Rarely will they just change their mind on the spot. This week we'll look at the appeal to nature.
This is the false, somewhat romantic idea that just because something comes from nature or from a natural source, it must therefore be pure, wholesome, beneficial, and healthy. Basically, good for you.
This fallacy can often be seen in the marketing of food and certain so-called alternative medicines. It plays on our notion of life in a simpler, more innocent time that really never existed. When people lived a more natural life, their life expectancy was generally shorter and plagued with bad health along the way.
I'm going to stick to natural products only from now on and steer clear of chemicals.
Somehow over the last few decades, the idea that chemicals are artificial and therefore bad has become a widely held public opinion. You have no doubt seen the words chemical-free on everything from food supplements to shampoo. Since even water is a chemical, its formula being the famous H2O, it's a wonder that this falsehood ever caught hold. Chemicals, be they natural or artificial, are neither good nor bad in themselves. It's how they are used and in what quantity or in what compound that determines their effect.
I'm not going to risk my children getting vaccinated. It is important that they get a dose of the measles to build up their natural immunity.
One of the privileges many of us have is to live in a society with advanced medical care which led to vaccination and the near eradication of diseases like measles. Even if a child is unfortunate enough to contract measles, our health system is ready if that child becomes seriously ill. In some parts of the world where people are less fortunate, each year thousands of children and even adults die from measles, which, after all, is a natural disease. Even COVID-19 is natural.
Many women these days are opting for natural childbirth in the comfort of their own home with family and a midwife on hand. This means that the child will start life in a peaceful and loving environment.
Newborn babies are incapable of knowing or caring where they are born and will not remember the event. While birth is indeed part of nature, so is the alarmingly high death rate for both mother and baby, where modern medical care is not available. For most of our ancestors, going back into the distant past, a natural childbirth was a time of both great anticipation and great apprehension. Nature is neither our enemy nor our friend. It is simply the ongoing process of the universe. We can point to much in nature that is good for us, like fresh air and necessary vitamins, and much that is bad, even fatal, like many natural diseases or natural disasters such as earthquakes, fires and floods. Just keep in mind that nature is a blind, uncaring process and not some benevolent entity that has our best interests at heart. This time we'll look at the false dilemma.
Also known as the false dichotomy, the either-or, and the false choice. This is when an argument is framed as having only two options or conclusions, when there are in fact other logical alternatives.
Not all black and white situations are truly black and white. Sometimes there are many other alternatives or shades of grey between the two extremes. Being asked to choose between the extremes can lead you to an unsatisfactory and even false conclusion.
The TV news show did a sting on a so-called psychic and showed that she was nothing more than a con artist. Other psychics, however, cannot be explained away so easily, so they must be real.
After many decades of investigations by Australian skeptics and people like James Randi, we know that many, Maybe the majority of people claiming to be psychic or mystical healers are not con artists per se, nor do they have genuine psychic powers. Many are, to one degree or another, deluded and really do think they have the powers they claim. They can be honest, caring people who only want to share what they perceive is their gift. There are also performers known as mentalists who also use hot and cold reading techniques and are good at reading people in a psychological way. This is a legitimate skill set and is valid entertainment. These other possibilities, however, are one step too far for most TV or other news investigations that need to give their audience a simple choice and report accordingly. The psychic is either a con artist or the real deal, never an entertainer, such as a mentalist, amateur psychologist, or deluded but well-meaning person.
If you're not for me, then you're against me.
This is a cry we've heard from politics to religion and in many other situations. It's an underhanded way of polarising people to gain their support. You might agree with much of what someone says, but at the same time have concerns or issues with other things. Not agreeing with someone does not therefore mean you are opposed to them.
I reject mainstream medicine because lots of people die due to medical accidents or misdiagnosis, and drug companies are just in it for the money.
It is true that medical accidents and misdiagnoses occur. Human error is a factor in everything that involves our input. Drug companies can indeed be profit-driven too. However, to reject all evidence-based medicine on these grounds and concede none of how often people are cured or saved is coming to an extreme conclusion based on a false dichotomy. Just because science-based medical practice isn't all good, it doesn't mean that it must be all bad and we should seek alternative medical treatments instead. It's so easy to be given a simple choice, not too much to consider, and with one of the choices made out to be the right one or the only real one to choose. There are times when a choice like this is obvious. For example, is slavery good, yes or no? But for many situations, the false dilemma can rob you of the real answer. Next time, we'll look at the opposite of the false dilemma, that of the middle ground. This time we'll look at the middle ground.
Also known as the false compromise and the argument to moderation. This is when it's asserted that the truth of the matter lies between two extremes and casts doubt on a well-reasoned and evidence-based conclusion.
This fallacy can come across as being very fair-minded or democratic, as it seems to appeal to an open-minded approach. But there are some issues and topics where enough evidence has been gathered for us to be very sure of the premise.
Some say climate change is real and the Earth is warming, but others say it's not happening, or even if it is, it's just part of a natural cycle of the planet. Until they all just make up their mind, I'm not going to commit one way or the other.
It's good to weigh up the arguments on any issue and listen to a wide range of opinions. But if you're waiting for everyone to make up their minds, you'll be waiting forever. While it could be said that science never ultimately makes up its mind, it does reach firm, if tentative, conclusions. There is no longer any doubt that humans contribute to global warming. However, science continues to fine-tune our knowledge and understanding of the phenomenon. Note too that the consensus on global warming isn't a middle ground negotiated between scientists, but a consensus of what the data shows, and the evidence clearly rests on one side.
I know some scientists say the Earth is billions of years old and we evolved from apes, but other scientists say there is proof for biblical creation, with the Earth being only 6,000 years old. Don't you think it's best we teach children both points of view and let them decide?
Here is a classic argument from the young Earth creationists. By saying there are scientists on both sides of the question implies that the established history of the Earth and the fact of evolution are in doubt. Both are simply not in doubt in the scientific community, but there will always be those who use the false balance to push their point of view. In this case, creationism. Sometimes there is a concession to the religious doctrine by using a combination of creationism and evolution to reach a hybrid middle ground, and this is also fallacious as the positions are diametrically opposed. Also remember that no matter what the topic, even if it's ridiculous, you'll always find someone calling themselves an expert to defend it.
I was watching a debate on TV about vaccination. They had a doctor talking about preventing whooping cough and measles with a vaccine, but for balance, they also had a naturopath to give the other side of the story.
Again and again, TV shows, especially breakfast TV that has maybe a 5 or 6 minute slot to fill, will cover an issue by getting in two people who represent, quote, both sides of an issue and let them fight it out. It makes for good TV, but leaves the viewers with the mistaken impression that there are two equal sides to an issue, in this case, vaccination. During the 2010s, medical scientist Dr. Rachel Dunlop of the Australian Skeptics took a strong stand against this false balance and refused to be part of any TV or radio program that would have her appear next to an anti-vaxxer. She did not want to give them undeserved credibility by appearing with her. There are so many examples where a middle ground simply does not exist. You cannot be half dead or a little bit pregnant. Despite this fallacy sounding so reasonable as we've seen, it is often used by others with a fringe opinion to try and cast doubt on the stronger opinion or even on established fact. This time we'll look at the slippery slope.
Also known as the thin edge of the wedge, or the domino fallacy, this is where it is asserted that a relatively small step or action in a certain direction will lead to a chain of events with a larger and negative result.
Imagine you are standing on top of a mountain and the path down is covered with ice. Take one small step on the path and before you know it, you are sliding down, unable to stop, and hit the bottom. You end up with unforeseen injuries and maybe crash into something else and cause damage. That's the basic idea with this logical fallacy. A small action now will inevitably lead to a chain of events with a bad result at the end.
If they regulate homeopathy, the next thing you know, they'll be regulating and eventually banning all forms of alternative medicine.
We see this slippery slope argument being used by proponents of so-called alternative medicine to protect their modality from what would be normal scrutiny. Homeopathy, like any other form of alternative medicine, and even mainstream medicine, should indeed be regulated, as it makes very specific health claims. But that does not mean it will therefore end up getting banned from use. In the case of homeopathy, it would be very hard to ban sugar pills.
If we don't ban genetically modified foods, we'll end up with Frankenfood.
Frankenfood first appeared in 1992 in a letter to the New York Times by English professor Paul Lewis, condemning the genetic engineering of crops. It has continued to be used as a scary term by anti-GMO interest groups, but has no basis in reality. This fear of GMO foods arose in reaction to the development of crops that are not modified by being selectively cultivated in a traditional way, but are instead modified in a lab. Perhaps the most famous example of this is when DNA Plant Technology of Oakland, California, which has since gone out of business, spliced a fish gene into a tomato. The aim was to insert an antifreeze gene that helps flounder survive frigid waters into a plant to help its resistance to cold. The fish gene tomato didn't grow fins, scales, or resemble a fish-tomato hybrid monster in any way. However, the fear-inducing imagery lives on despite being a total misrepresentation of a tomato that could have grown well in cooler climates had it ever been permitted to reach the market. It's understandable to be a bit fearful of the potential of new technology that we don't understand well, but improving crops genetically does not mean that we are sliding towards the development of frankenfoods.
So, they want to ban the teaching of creation science in schools? What next? Soon they'll be trying to close down our churches.
We mentioned so-called creation science in the middle ground fallacy. While there are very good reasons not to teach this religion-based mythology posing as a science in the classroom, it does not therefore mean people should or will be stopped from practicing their own religion in their own places of worship. Yes, there are slippery slopes in this world, but there are also ways and means of avoiding them or breaking the chain of events. Just because something you do might lead to a larger and negative outcome, it doesn't mean it always will. Small risks you take now can be a step in the wrong or in the right direction. One thing does not always lead to another. This time, we'll look at the false equivalence fallacy.
This is when it's argued that two different things or points of view that may have only passing or superficial similarities are in fact logically equivalent.
We've all heard the saying, "You are comparing apples with oranges." Yes, they are both fruit, both round, and both are good to eat. But despite these similarities, they are not the same thing and should not be compared as such.
Medical intuitives, those gifted people who can sense what is going on in your body, are very caring people who treat thousands of patients each year. Yes, they can make mistakes from time to time, but so do mainstream doctors. So in fact, they're much the same.
Yes, both medical intuitives and mainstream doctors are caring people who do make mistakes from time to time. They also probably drive cars, listen to music, and brush their teeth. However, all these things do not mean that they are similar when it comes to healthcare and advice. While mainstream doctors are trained in and follow the scientific method, medical intuitives rarely have medical training and rely on the unproven and frankly quite bizarre idea that they can use something akin to ESP to diagnose illnesses.
When it comes to vaccination, we have experts who say it's safe and effective, but then again, other experts say it's not worth the risk and has links to autism.
The term expert seems to be used quite a bit these days. Just because someone is known as an expert or even labels themselves as an expert, it doesn't necessarily mean they have valid expert knowledge in a subject. We even have the situation where people refer to themselves as having mastered a modality, for example, Reiki masters, even though there is no credible evidence that Reiki, based on mystical energies, exists at all.
The stars and the planets are wonderful and mysterious. Astrologers and astronomers continue to study the night sky to learn more about our universe.
The science of astrology evolved out of the natural wonder and curiosity of our ancestors when they looked up at the night sky. It was not surprising they saw patterns in the stars and made up stories of gods, animals, and great adventures, and did so all over the world for thousands of years. In Australia, for example, the Aboriginal people used the appearance of stars at various times of the year to help them to know when to hunt for certain animals. However, today's astrology charts and predictions have very little to do with the real scientific study of stars, planets and galaxies. That your personality or events in your future can be read by looking at the heavens has long since been shown to be nothing more than superstition and magical thinking. In the most important ways, you cannot compare astrology with astronomy. Like many other logical fallacies, it's not always easy and obvious to tell when the false equivalence fallacy is being used. Sometimes it takes a little thought or even research to know for sure. It's important not to be too critical with yourself and learn from each experience. This time we'll look at moving the goalposts.
Also known as raising the bar and the shifting sands, this is when your opponent does not accept a successful answer to their challenge and insists on you answering more and more questions.
Sometimes people simply cannot accept the fact that their challenge has been answered, thus showing that their own point of view is wrong. Instead of acknowledging this, and that can be awkward for any of us, they'll add to their challenge with new conditions that makes it harder and harder to show them wrong.
A creationist challenged a paleontologist to show at least one example of a transitional fossil that links dinosaurs to birds. When the paleontologist did just that, the creationist complained that all this new fossil did was to create two new gaps on either side of the fossil record and wanted yet more examples to fill in those gaps.
Since the creationists' worldview and religion are to them beyond question, it would be very hard, bordering on impossible for them to accept evidence that contradicts this view. They often resort to moving the goalposts to preserve their belief system. In fact, science has discovered thousands of examples of transitions in the fossil record, showing clear evolutionary steps within a species and from one species to another.
I think the moon landings were faked in a movie studio. There was no way the USA had the technology to reach the moon in 1969. I mean, look at all the hundreds of inconsistencies and impossible things we are supposed to believe.
As each claim made by those espousing a moon landing conspiracy is met and debunked, for example, the multiple light sources on the moon or the lack of stars in photos of the lunar sky, they either reject the evidence outright or may well accept the evidence, but then move on to yet another claim and another and another. There appears to be no degree of evidence that will finally convince them that the landings were real and humans have been to the moon.
A breatharian, someone who claims they can live on little more than fresh air, was challenged to prove her amazing claim. She agreed to be watched day and night in a city hotel room, but after only 48 hours she displayed symptoms of acute dehydration, stress and high blood pressure. She claimed it was due to polluted air and was moved to another hotel in the countryside, but didn't improve.
This really happened. In the year 2000, the 60 Minutes TV show in Australia arranged for breatharian Jasmine or Ellen Grieve to be tested as per her claim. She was happy with the test conditions, but when it became apparent she was deteriorating from lack of food, she changed the conditions of the test, in effect, moving the goalposts. Even though 60 Minutes agreed, her health continued to decline and the test was cancelled. Protecting our worldview or belief system is a very human thing to do, and we all do it to one degree or another. It can at times protect us from simply believing in whatever someone tells us, and we should not be afraid to ask for more information and evidence. You might call it healthy skepticism. But there comes a point when moving the goalposts is about rejecting evidence that conflicts with what we want or need to be true. This time, we'll look at non sequitur.
The term non sequitur comes to us from Latin and translates as "it does not follow." It is a statement or conclusion that doesn't logically follow from the previous statement or the main point of the argument.
We might call this the "what's that got to do with it" fallacy. Many times, people will not answer the question asked or tack on extra unnecessary information that detracts from the question at hand.
That awful skeptic questioned my psychic intuition and mediumship, but what would he know? And anyway, I had a traumatic childhood and have suffered all my life.
This example is based on a real complaint made by someone claiming to have psychic powers when questioned by a skeptical investigator. While we can sympathise with aspects of the psychic's life, their troubles really have no bearing on whether or not they have mystical powers. It can, however, have the effect of deflecting the valid inquiries or criticisms of the skeptic. It's all too easy to paint a skeptic as being negative or uncaring.
The history of mainstream medicine is littered with bad reactions and side effects. That's why alternative medicine works so much better.
There's an old saying, if a medicine doesn't have side effects, it doesn't have effects to begin with. However, in the case of homeopathy, for example, it's clear why it claims to have no side effects, as there is nothing in it to cause effects in the first place. Whether or not a particular pharmaceutical drug has reactions or side effects has nothing to do with the efficacy of something calling itself alternative medicine. It's unrelated, and it just doesn't follow.
Science tells us that energy can neither be created nor destroyed, but it can be transformed. This surely shows that spiritual energy is real and Reiki healing is possible.
In the skeptical world, there is something called Hyman's categorical imperative, named after skeptical investigator Professor Ray Hyman, which says, "Do not try to explain something until you are sure there is something to be explained." In this case, we have no reason to think that spiritual energy or Reiki, the claimed mystical energy, even exist, despite many people believing in them. Talking about the nature of energy as discovered and described by science and then linking it to unproven claims is like an old smoke and mirrors trick, causing you to be distracted from the real point. It's easy to see how people might use a non sequitur if they truly believe in something like mystical energies. To them, the link to real energy is not a non sequitur at all, and they cannot see why it would not follow nor be related. This commonly occurs when this fallacy is used, and you might have quite a task explaining this to your opponent. This time, we'll look at the argument from personal incredulity.
Also known as the argument from personal astonishment. This is when someone cannot accept an argument because they don't believe in it or they don't understand the premise and the points being made. That is to say, they think it's false because they cannot see how it can be true.
If someone is incredulous, it means they are unable or unwilling to believe something. This might happen to any of us, but as ever, it pays to keep an open mind.
There is no way the psychic could have known the things she did about me. I didn't tell her anything. Yet she named members of my family by using her gift of clairvoyance. There's just no other explanation.
One of the classic red flags for skeptics is when someone has a so-called psychic reading and says, "It was amazingly accurate. They could not have known these things about me. I never told anyone about them." Or, "That psychic was spot on and I'm a skeptic." Now, of course, not many people make a study of cold reading, which is the most often used method of doing what appears to be a psychic reading. As most sitters are ignorant of the psychological interplay at work, they assume, quite naturally, that the person they are seeing must really be psychic. Think of it this way. When you see a great magician amaze and stun an audience by doing the impossible, you know deep down it is just a trick and not real. In this case, however, not knowing how the trick works does not lead you to think magic is real, as you know better.
They say that vaccination is safe and effective, but I cannot see how jabbing a poor innocent baby with a needle full of toxins can be good.
Somewhere in there, amongst all the emotive language and scaremongering, is an argument from personal incredulity. If something works, it works regardless of whether we understand it or not, and regardless of whether we are opposed to it or not. Yes, we do take a lot of things on trust in our society. When it comes to vaccination, we trust that the doctors and medical scientists know what they are doing and what they offer does work, even if we don't understand it ourselves. However, if we took the time and effort, we could come to understand it, and understanding the basic principles of how vaccines work is really not that difficult.
How crazy it is to believe the world is some sort of spinning ball in space. I can't feel it spin. When I'm flying in a plane, the horizon still looks flat. How is that possible if the world was a globe?
Here we have a case of someone not willing or not wanting to believe a premise. In this case, the shape of the world, as it contradicts what they accept to be true based on their own observations. In the case of many flat earthers, also known as globe deniers, it's also based on the information they get from online blogs and videos by other flat earthers. Conspiracy theorists love YouTube. Being incredulous might serve you well when you first encounter an extraordinary claim that flies in the face of everything you know. But, as Carl Sagan famously said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof. So, don't be afraid to at least look at any extraordinary proof that is offered. This time, we'll look at the relative privation fallacy.
This fallacy, also known as not as bad as, can be seen as a type of red herring or distraction. The fallacy is essentially an argument that a certain issue is not important or does not deserve attention and resources because there are other and more important issues.
Another variation of the relative privation fallacy is to compare something with the best or the worst case scenario, thus making it seem much better or worse by comparison.
As a naturopath, I can tell you that mistakes are sometimes made by practitioners of alternative medicine, but that is nothing compared to the thousands of mistakes and deaths each year due to mainstream medicine.
That people die under the care of mainstream medicine is not in doubt. But keep in mind that what mainstream medicine does is to look after millions of people who range from being mildly unwell to very unwell to being critically unwell. Yes, it's not a perfect system, but that does not justify nor diminish the mistakes made by so-called alternative medicine.
Why should we bother doing something in Australia for climate change and the environment when China and other countries are much bigger polluters?
It may well be that other countries contribute a much greater volume of greenhouse gases or other pollutants than Australia, but that is no reason at all for Australia, especially as one of the highest polluters per capita, if not as a total amount, or any other country to give up doing everything we can to combat this worldwide problem. If every country gave up using the above argument as a justification, the situation would be much, much worse.
You skeptics have been trying to debunk silly things like UFOs and psychics for years, and people still believe in them. You should give up and put your time and efforts into being skeptical of far more important issues.
This is an argument skeptical groups hear from time to time. That some people don't find investigating UFOs or homeopathy or psychics of interest is fine. But that doesn't mean skeptical groups should suddenly change their focus. We wouldn't expect the local chess club to give up chess just because someone thinks backgammon is a better game. The implication is that you cannot be real skeptics as you are not skeptical of what I am skeptical of. And what I am skeptical of is more important than what you are skeptical of. The relative privation fallacy can easily take you away from the argument in hand and have you wasting your time down some rabbit hole. Try to keep your opponent and yourself to the topic in question. This time we'll look at tu quoque,
Also known as the appeal to hypocrisy or the look who's talking. This is a type of ad hominem attack and comes into play when an inconsistency or hypocrisy from your side is used by your opponent to justify their position or to denigrate your position.
This fallacy really is a lazy and cheap way of trying to justify a position. It can be used to avoid the real argument at hand, deflecting attention to the past actions. It's meeting criticism with criticism.
So what if sometimes creation scientists have been caught out using bad data or fudging research? Just look at mainstream science. Skullduggery goes on all the time.
No doubt about it. Some scientists have and still do fudge figures, cut corners, and even produce faulty research. Not good, but it does not therefore justify or somehow make better the bad science conducted by creationists or from any other field of pseudoscience.
Here in Australia, the CSIRO, the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation, once told us we shouldn't eat eggs due to their high cholesterol content. Now they tell us eggs are fine to eat. How can we trust them with any science?
That science can and does change its mind about things is really one of its great strengths. Imagine if it was more like pseudoscience or religion, that when in the face of new and better information, It stubbornly refused to accept it was wrong. If that were the case, we'd all be back in the 14th century.
Why should we listen to the skeptics? Weren't they the fools who said climate change was a hoax?
The skeptical movement and those in it can and do change their mind. While in the early days of the climate change issue, some skeptics were indeed skeptical of it, these opinions were, over time, changed as more evidence was presented. These days, climate change deniers often, and incorrectly, use the term skeptic to refer to themselves. All of us are fallible, and there will be times when we don't act consistently or even rationally. Whether or not someone follows their own advice or even appears to contradict themselves, it should be noted, but don't let that distract from the question in hand. And ultimately, it does not justify similar action. This time we'll look at No True Scotsman.
This interesting sounding fallacy comes to us from the notion that all Scotsmen are brave, and if one turns out to be a coward, then he cannot really be a true Scotsman.
This fallacy can be used by your opponent to change the parameters of an argument to seem to save them from being wrong. It's a type of moving the goalposts fallacy, which we covered in an earlier episode.
An online video showing some of the tricks behind applied kinesiology had a skeptic pushing down on someone's arm at different angles to get different results. However, according to kinesiologists, this is not how real applied kinesiology is done at all.
Applied kinesiology is a modality that claims that ailments in the body can be diagnosed via muscle testing. It is considered to be a pseudoscience. The video referred to is real, made by Richard Saunders, and many of the unhappy comments on this video from applied kinesiologists use the No True Scotsman fallacy. See for yourself by looking up applied kinesiology, how it's done, on YouTube. Then watch the countless other videos from applied kinesiologists themselves doing more or less the same sort of thing. Therefore, protesting that one example is not real kinesiology doesn't get the modality off the hook when it really is all a variation of the same basic practice.
So, the skeptics tested all these water diviners, huh? And they all failed? Well, either the test was wrong, or those diviners were just doing it wrong, or they weren't real diviners at all.
Once again, we have an example based on a real event. When water diviners fail tests conducted by the Australian Skeptics or similar organisations around the world, and by the way, that is 100% of the time so far, other diviners or believers in divining will sometimes claim that the participants simply did not know what they were doing, as any real diviner would have passed the tests.
I'm sorry, but if you believe in a god or gods, then you are not a real skeptic.
Some people can get quite worked up if they find others in the skeptical movement also happen to have a religious faith. But for many skeptical groups, one's religion or lack thereof is simply not of great importance. They can still be skeptics. While many skeptics are atheists, the two movements are not synonymous. Sometimes it's easier to dismiss something or someone who does not live up to our ideals as not being really part of what makes those ideals important to us. As with many logical fallacies, this one revolves around us keeping our particular worldview safe from contradictory information. Knowing a logical fallacy when you hear one, and even knowing its name, is important when arguing your point of view. However, you may come across as arrogant and not get very far if you call it out by name to your opponent when you hear it being used. If your opponent calls you out for using one, it's time to stop and think about how you are making your case. Use your knowledge of logical fallacies wisely, and remember that even if your point of view is right and you know all the pitfalls in arguing your case, it doesn't always mean you'll win on the day. And as skeptics, we must also remember that we too can be wrong at times. I'm Michelle Bijkersma from the Vic Skeptics. Thanks for listening.